Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD. And today, I could not be more excited to talk to you about Near to the Wild Heart by Clarice Lispector. So some of you know that my PhD is mostly in Spanish literature. That's the main emphasis. But I also have a specialization in French. And at Berkeley, you had to take a third language, a third Romance language. I considered Italian, incredible amounts of good Italian literature. But I chose Portuguese entirely because I wanted to be able to read Clarice Lispector in the original Portuguese. I mean, that now is like 30 years ago, but I remember just like my mind being blown. This is a voice that was absolutely singular in so many different ways, and I was really pleased to be able to really comprehend it. Sadly, my Portuguese has waned. I do not have a lot of opportunity to practice my Portuguese, and I actually read a lot in Spanish and French, but not so much in Portuguese. Obviously, also, my Portuguese did not ever get to the level of my Spanish and French. But for the longest time, I have been considering a return to Clarice, in part because my daughter, who is 26 years old now, we were talking about the surreal at some point, and her name came up. And apparently on TikTok these days, Clarice Lispector is getting a lot of attention. That made me so happy. I mean, occasionally these things will happen. I don't fully understand TikTok. I don't have it. I mean, I understand it, but I don't have it. I was so happy to hear that a young 26-year-old woman studying art history is really curious about Clarice Lispector because of TikTok. We are diving in today to Near to the Wild Heart. This is her very first novel. When I read her back in the day in graduate school, I read both this and her final novel. And I'd like to actually, repeat that because it's just sort of nice, the symmetry of looking at an early novel and then a very late novel. It is widely held, though, that she had this voice. Her kind of mature voice was already present even in this very first thing that she published when she was only 23 years old. So at some point in the future, I would love to contrast the two, but I was so happy to dive in and remember the unique feel of this writer. I mean, this is work that feels unlike anything else. It's compared to a lot of other modernist people like Joyce and like Woolf, and I think in some ways that's kind of an apt comparison, although Clarice herself really resists it, which we're about to get to. But to me, the innovation in the language and the way that she's really pushing language to its very limits, in fact, at sometimes for a lot of readers past its normal limits, she's really doing something new, which really is sort of the modernist manifesto. In some ways, this novel does to me feel a tiny bit adolescent. And I mean that both like in a good sense and in a bad sense. There are ways in which she is kind of waxing philosophical here that feel to me like a young person. I mean, it also feels like a very old person. But there is a certain kind of youthfulness to this. And I'm dying to look at The Hour of the Star, which is her final novel, just to compare. I mean, I think there's some wisdom and there's some sort of epiphanies that occur in that final novel from what my terrible memory is resurfacing for me that are really different, but also a very apt continuation of what she is doing here. So for those of you who like an agenda, we're going to talk first about her biography. In the case of Clarice Lispector, it is actually a very important biography. Sometimes I feel like the biography is more important than others. In her case, it really does inform the writing, so I think it is germane. We're then going to dive into the work. We're going to talk about the title. That's where James Joyce comes in. And then we're going to dive into the actual work itself. We're going to talk about stream of consciousness. We're going to talk about her use of language and figurative language. We're going to talk about freedom and independence. This is a book that if it is about anything, it is about the notion of freedom and independence. Of course, throughout, we're going to be looking at her absolutely inimitable prose. And before we look at the close of the novel, we're going to do this little party trick that I like to do, where I'm going to just like flip open to a page of the book. If I were with a group of people, I would have them like choose a number and we would go to that page. But I'm just going to like zoop through the book and I'm going to stop somewhere. And honestly, we could look at any sentence in this book. We're going to look at the top of the page, any sentence of this book, and you would come away with like some gigantic philosophical questions, but also prose that really, really rewards some really serious attention. Okay, so we're going to dive into the biography of Clarice Lispector. She was born in 1920 in Ukraine. This was at a time, she is Jewish, in a Jewish family. Her father was actually like very learned and came from a line of rabbis. And she was born at a time when there were terrible pogroms happening in Ukraine at the time. The family fled to Romania and then finally landed in Brazil. Clarice is the youngest of 3 girls. When she arrives in Brazil, she's 2 years old. It's important to remember in many ways that this is someone who is very much an outsider. She is a Jewish person in what is, especially back in the early 20th century, a predominantly Catholic country. She speaks differently, partially because she's growing up in a family where they are speaking Hebrew, but also because she had actually kind of like a speech impediment. I think actually one that made her language very alluring, but her Portuguese did sound a little bit different from the people around her. So in many ways, she came in as a sort of an outsider, but everyone, including Clarice herself, is so clear about the fact that she identifies as like a very, staunch Brazilian. She is someone who feels very Brazilian. She eventually marries a diplomat and lives in Europe, and the whole time is kind of just missing all of the brightness and the warmth of what really feels like her home country. I'm going to be relying today a lot on the guy who wrote the notes to my copy. I have the Penguin Modern Classics copy. His name is Benjamin Moser, and I'm going to be relying a lot on both his notes and also a couple of interviews that I heard him give. He wrote a book called Why This World, which is a biography of Clarice Lispector. I'm kind of dying to read it, but honestly, I have so much other stuff to read that I do have a sense I will not get to that. Plus, in listening to Moser, I feel like I really got a good sense of a lot of the stuff that was formative and really important for her. One of those things is that she was born at a time when there was a lot of nationalist kind of fervor that was happening in Brazil. It was a time when people were not allowed to speak other languages. There was this real sense of like wanting everyone to feel like first and foremost Brazilian. And Clarice really does identify that way, has a huge love for this country that she emigrated to. She will go on later in life to be like this incredible superstar. There are all sorts of works of art, plays still to this day. People are doing, they're making music out of her work and they're making plays and they're doing all sorts of different things. There's a movie about like an adaptation of The Hour of the Star by someone very important. So she is someone who became kind of a literary superstar and also someone who had this incredible cult following. For those of you who are American, I feel like it's like Joan Didion, but plus, like Joan Didion, like to the max. So one of the darkest things, and something that really colors the rest of her life and colors her writing, that Benjamin Moser talks about, is that when the family was experiencing those pogroms in Ukraine, her mother was raped by a Russian soldier, and she contracts syphilis. So as they are emigrating, obviously she still has this. This is not a disease that you could, rid yourself of. There is a belief at that time that pregnancy was a way that you could cure yourself of syphilis. So she becomes pregnant with Clarice in this hope to cure herself of this disease. It does not work, unsurprisingly. And her mother dies when Clarice is 9 years old. This is something that she feels very guilty about in many ways, which is such a crazy thing, that she somehow didn't, cure her mother. Benjamin Moser talks also about how as a young person, she would write all of these stories and each one of them would be these kind of magical incantation-y type things where she was trying to tell a story that would allow her mother to live. Moser talks a lot about mysticism and about this idea, and it's so nice. He defines mysticism very concisely as a way for someone to kind of contact the divine. So poor little Clarice Lispector is writing these stories in the hopes that they will have some kind of magical properties and save her mother, which they do not. And when we talk about Near to the Wild Heart, the absence of the mother is gigantic. The preoccupation with becoming a mother or being a mother or not having a mother is really a very central piece of the book. So I do think it's important to understand that not only did she lose her mother when she was 9, but it was this kind of spectacular thing that came out of this insane, like, anti-Semitic violence that had this long-lasting repercussion even after they fled the country and were living in exile. So you really feel the presence or the absence of the mother in this book that she writes when she's 23. So she goes on to study law, and she is a journalist. She's a working journalist when she's 23 years old. She wrote this in just a very short amount of time, less than a year. And it has very good critical acclaim. It was published in like a bright pink cover that was like books for women kind of a thing. And I think people very quickly realized that this was not just like some sort of ladies' book, that in fact it had huge literary import, and it like quickly became this incredible phenomenon. She went on to marry a diplomat and had 2 sons and traveled widely. Eventually, she came back to Brazil with her 2 boys, she leaving her husband to do his diplomatic work, and returned to Brazil in a way that really demonstrates her deep, deep affinity, her deep attachment to the country of Brazil. She dies in 1977 at the age of 57. And I heard this thing in a different interview from someone else. And all of the stories about her life like seem so sensational that I was like, really, is this true? I looked up the thing about syphilis because Benjamin Moser seems like a very responsible biographer. But I also was like, really? Like, that sounds incredible. But there was also an incident where she was smoking a cigarette. You can imagine she's very glamorous. If you were on the YouTube channel, I will show you some of the pictures of Clarice. I mean, I should not say that smoking is elegant. Did I just say that? That's a crazy thing. But I mean, you know, whatever. Just call me a child of the 20th century, because that is like, we were just, the media really fed that to us, that smoking was cool. So anyway, she was very cool, very elegant. She was smoking a lot and set all of these like pages of her work on fire. And the story goes that she's like patting the fire out, and she suffered these terrible burns all over her like hands and arms and legs. Her right arm almost had to be amputated. She spent many months in the hospital. I mean, this is a woman like that's the kind of like accident. It's a little like Frida Kahlo too. Like you have kind of an accident like that really would feel life changing. And then she dies in 1977 at the age of 57. Before we dive into the text itself, I want to take a look at a couple of the comments that are, or the things that are written in the introduction, because I think they're really well said and really inform our thinking on Clarice. So on page 8 of my vintage modern classics, and by 8, I mean VIII. I hope that they're still teaching. I said this before at one point. I hope they're still teaching Roman numerals in school. Like, that seems like one of those things that's going to really be phased out. I love a Roman numeral, partially because it takes a little effort to figure out what's happening here. The number 8, it's really cute too. It's not like the uppercase ones because it's a page number. It's like lowercase. It's like a little tiny V and like the 3 little I's with dots. So on page 8 in my copy, we have Benjamin Moser giving us a little more of a sense of what was happening when she was publishing this book. He says that she quit this little maid's room that she was living in with her sisters and her brother-in-law. This was a family, importantly, I should have mentioned this in the biography. Benjamin Moser's helping me remember now. This was a family that really lived in a very poor part of Brazil and really had a hard time making ends meet. Her father, always, you know, very intellectual guy, kind of rabbi status, but always had a hard time providing for his family. So she's in like pretty serious poverty here. She's living, you know, with an entire, apparently her whole family in this little maid's room. And it says that she left that room and spent a month in a nearby boarding house where she worked intensely. At length, the book took shape, but she feared it was more a pile of notes than a full-fledged novel. Her first love, the writer Lucio Cardoso, whose homosexuality doomed the relationship, assured her that the fragments were a book in themselves. So I find that so interesting because it does very much have the sense of like this fragmented thing. It does not read like your kind of typical realist novel. It's really doing something very different, which is, of course, you know, that's like the whole thing of it, is how revolutionary and how innovative it is in terms of language. But it's also interesting to know that she had this, like, was very conscious of the fragmentation, which again is another like real, like a strength of the work. And that kind of fragmentation and that kind of like pushing at pushing against the conventions of your normal realist novel, that also marks this as modernist. So when we think of modernism and Joyce and Woolf in particular, and mostly I know this because of Virginia Woolf, who I love. I mean, her work is just like, it's so formative for me. But after the First World War, which felt like such a cataclysm to her, she really had this sense that the novel, it was kind of defunct. It didn't work to talk about the horrors that were happening in the way that people had been writing novels forever. So what she did instead was to really like descend into the psychology of her characters and things, because she was trying to describe these deep feelings of cataclysm and horror and shock. And because she was trying to work on that level, I'm kind of getting around to stream of consciousness here, because she was working on that level in the psychology and like really trying to describe how things felt, because it was such a harrowing time for like everyone. That is when you have the stream of consciousness emerge with both Joyce and with Woolf. So this is very much in that same vein. And there's an interesting thing that happens because the title it comes from James Joyce, which we're going to get to that in a minute. And everyone then assumed that she had read Joyce and that Joyce was like this huge influence on her, because the book does feel very much like James Joyce. not so much the earlier Joyce, but the later Joyce, the more experimental Joyce. And it feels enough like that everyone assumed that she, had read a lot of him and in some ways was kind of emulating his work. And that really did not sit well with her. So she said the following, and this is actually important. Another interview I listened to, they were like, apparently there are receipts that show that she didn't even own those books until after Near to the Wild Heart was published, which, sure, I'm glad that they're like, people are really doing their diligence here. But to me, it also doesn't matter. I mean, I believe her. I think that she probably hadn't read Joyce before now, and I understand why you would be bothered by it. I'm going to argue as we move through here, too, that she's doing this thing where she's really writing from the body. And this idea of writing from the body is much more, it's something that you see in women writers. I mean, I'm now wading also deeply into some like feminist literary theory here, but you have people like Hélène Cixous and Julia Kristeva, but you have this sense of women as writing from a body that is different from the male body. I mean, it's very essentialist and very like rooted in biology, which is problematic. And you can feel that throughout. Yes, there's a lot of Joyce that we can read in here, but there's also a lot of other stuff going on. So Moser tells us this about the sort of controversy that she might have taken, that she might have been influenced by Joyce. This is still on page 8. Lucio suggested a title borrowed from James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. He was alone, he was unheeded, happy, and near to the wild heart of life. This became the book's epigraph, which, together with the occasional use of the stream of consciousness method, led certain critics to describe the book as Joycean. The comparison annoyed Clarice. I discovered the quote, the title of the book, and Joyce himself once the book was already finished. I wrote it in 8 or 9 months while I was studying, working, and getting engaged. But the book has no direct influence from my studies, my engagement, Joyce, or my work. It's so interesting. I mean, she sounds like, yes, kind of defensive, but it's kind of true. Like, I would not have said that, like, this was written by a law student who, I mean, there is that thing about Ottavio, like, reading the, like, civic law book or wanting to write the civic law book. But this does not feel like someone who was immersed in the study of the law and who was writing journalism. This text could not be further from, like, legalese or the idea of like, spare journalistic writing. It also, I mean, if she's writing this while she's getting engaged, she's really having some thoughts about how marriage might go. And I would hope that her experience of engagement doesn't have a ton to do with what Joanna in the book is experiencing. And I want to interject at this point a point that Moser makes not in the beginning of this book, not in the introduction, but in one of the interviews that I heard him give. And this was so fascinating to me. I remembered this about Portuguese language, but I don't think even when I was reading Clarice that I was really cognizant of this. What he said is that when people are comparing her to Joyce, mostly they're talking about the stream of consciousness, but they're also talking about the ways that she's like having language break down. Ulysses, Finnegan's Wake, those are books that are very famous for language being kind of pushed beyond what like your average reader can understand. And Clarice does some of that too. But what Moser tells us that is so important is that the way that Portuguese functions is much like Latin. So you have cases. What that means is that the order of the words is not that important. You can tell from the ending of the word if it's a subject or an adjective or an object. So you don't have to rely on word order in order for things to make sense. So what happens with Clarice is she plays with that even further. So if there would be, a couple of different ways that you might order a sentence in normal Portuguese language, she mixes things up even further in ways that are really striking and that actually kind of give language like new life in some ways. Moser talks about the fact, and I did not know this, that Clarice presents challenges even to, oh my God, if you can hear that, that is my dog. She's rolling around on her back, one of them, and like moaning and groaning. Oh my God. But in Portuguese, and now I totally lost my train of thought. Oh, but so it's like, it's difficult even for readers of Portuguese, even people who have spoken Portuguese their whole lives. She presents a challenge because she is doing this thing. Oh my God, my dog. Because she's further breaking down language. Moser goes so far as to say that what she's doing is cubist, and I really like that. The surreal and all of those isms, cubism, fauvism, Dadaism, all of those are happening, in the time from when she was born in 1920. She was sort of born in the midst of all of this kind of surreal. So the idea of cubism here and the idea of pushing language beyond its kind of everyday parameters is so apt and so interesting. you can imagine that this also creates real problems where translation is concerned. And Moser talks about, he translated a bunch of her work, and he talked about how it's so tempting to kind of order things in a way that is more pleasing or more like familiar to an English reader's ear, and how you really have to resist that temptation. And there's another phenomenon where people will think it's a bad translation because I just can't get over my dog over there. She will stop at some point. But people think it's a bad translation because the word order and the syntax is so strange. But what we have to do is trust that in fact, this is what Clarice herself meant. So the next thing I want to look at is also in the intro here. And what this is, it's like a little like pasted together. That's not really how to put this, but it's a little amalgamation of a bunch of the critical things, like right when the novel was published, what the critics were saying. I like looking at this partially because it tells us like what a phenomenon it was at the time, but it also, I mean, this is difficult reading, people. Like Clarice is not straightforward. It's so funny. A couple of different interviews I listened to, the people were like, it's difficult, but it's not difficult because you totally understand it. And I was like, I don't think that's true. I think this is a book where there are parts that the interpretations are so like multitudinous. Like there's so many different ways that you can interpret something that the idea of like feeling like you've understood it feels a little bit naive in the way that like saying that you've understood Ulysses is. What these people are talking about is you really can understand the emotional force behind it. And that I do agree with. And I love the fact that people acknowledge that the language is difficult, but they don't think it's difficult to read. But so I want to read this little thing. And at the end, there's something that really made me bristle. So here we have on page 9 of the introduction. Clarice Lispector, critics wrote, was the rarest literary personality in our world of letters, something exceptional, possessed of a bewildering verbal richness. The whole book is a miracle of balance perfectly engineered, combining the intellectual lucidity of the characters of Dostoevsky with the purity of a child. So the thing that I bristled at was the child. I have a sense that most of these critics who are writing are men. And I appreciate the fact that they are listening and they are understanding like the true genius of this book that is written by this young woman. But when they called her a child, it felt patronizing and just kind of like yucky to me. It's very much like when we have Wuthering Heights and it's a book that's very strange and no one knows what to do with it and it feels cruel and kind of crazy. And so Charlotte Bronte, who is the sister of Emily, who actually wrote Wuthering Heights, Charlotte writes this introduction to the second edition that's basically like, oh my gosh, my sister is like this crazy wild being and she's just like a child and she's just like so free in a way that felt very minimizing and very diminishing and really like not great when you look back at it. I think you understand in the time what she's doing, but it was not like an acknowledgement of her sister's incredible genius. We have the same thing here. I understand also that when the person is saying that it's the mind of a child, partially that's because we do have Joanna when she's a child in the book. Like we start from childhood, very early childhood, and we move all the way through, the mid-20s. So I understand that there is a child's kind of vantage point here, and she does that very well. But my sense is that when he says, she's kind of like Dostoevsky, but also a child, I'm not sure that he is giving her full due. I also think it's funny because I myself, I marked a couple of things in the beginning that to me felt really adolescent, and I can't believe that I'm criticizing it, but I do think that's in part because this is a book that is written by a young woman. I also think some of the kind of philosophizing here to me feels repetitive, and I kept doing this weird thing where I was remembering my high school boyfriend. This was a guy, he was so bright, like really a very smart guy. His dyslexia was so bad that he literally couldn't read. He barely graduated from high school. At one point, I had to read all of Little Dorrit to him or something. It's actually like a real problem and a sign of the times. I mean, in the late 1980s, we were not diagnosing things like dyslexia very well. But this was a guy who was really given to a lot of philosophizing. And even at the time, he would say these pronouncements that would sound kind of impressive and feel very metaphysical. And I'd be like, I'm not really sure that this is like as groundbreaking as you think it is. There were times that the prose was reminding me of That Boyfriend, which was like a very pleasant thing in some ways, but it was speaking a little bit to the youth of the book. So it's interesting when he's like, oh, it's through the mind of a child, and I'm like, oh, she's not a child, and then I'm like, wait, actually, in some ways, this does feel a little bit adolescent. So, and again, before we dive in, I want to look at two more brief things from the intro. One of them situates this book in terms of Brazilian literature, and I think that's an important thing because it really speaks to how innovative the prose is, and also describes a bit of the sort of nationalistic thing that was happening in Brazil at the time. It speaks to like the way that she was even more innovative than we might think. So this is on page 10 of the intro. The book's strange voice, the foreign climate of its unusual language, made the deepest impression on its early readers. It did have points of resemblance with earlier Brazilian writing. Clarice Lispector's work appears in our literary world as the most serious attempt at the introspective novel, wrote the dean of São Paulo critics, Sergio Millier. For the first time, a Brazilian author goes beyond simple approximation in this almost virgin field of our literature. For the first time, an author penetrates the depths of the psychological complexity of the modern soul. Partially, I wanted to read that too because the idea of penetrating, does he say penetrating? Yes, penetrating the depths, the psychological depths of the modern soul. That is also a very good description both of modernism, but also of this idea of the stream of consciousness, the idea of an introspective novel, one that's showing us the inside of this, well, it's not just Joanna. There are lots of we have actually many different narrators in this book, which I think gets overlooked. We're going to take a peek at that. But you do have this idea of really like plumbing the psychological depths. And the last thing I want to look at is on page 12. So one of the things for me in the book through this reading that I was really preoccupied by was the idea of God, like capital G God. And it was very helpful to have some Benjamin Moser's ideas about Judaism and about Jewish mysticism in particular to sort of help me understand. So he talks about the fact that in Jewish culture in general, that the name of like God is something that isn't to be spoken. We don't really, in Hebrew, I think they're like, it's both part of every letter, maybe is what he was saying, or every word, the notion of God, but is also not something that you can pronounce. And that also Judaism, like everything about it, all the prayer, it all sort of is helping you in this search to find this God or the name of the God. So for me, it was really helpful not only to think about her as someone who had to flee a country and whose mother died because of anti-Semitism, but also someone who's deeply invested in this kind of mysticism. So on page 12, we have this. The search for that mystic word, the word that has its own light, is the search of a lifetime. That search was an urgent preoccupation of centuries of Jewish mystics. Just as God, in Clarice's writing, is utterly devoid of any moral meaning, so does language signify nothing beyond what it expresses, the symbol of the thing in the thing itself. So one of the things that they're getting at here is this idea that words, I mean, it doesn't take much thought to realize how arbitrary language is. The fact that I'm calling my glasses, the word glasses has nothing to do with the actual like item itself. And so if you think about that in terms of how we conceptualize God or how we conceptualize love or even fear, there are ways that we conceptualize these things and we make them real because we say a word. But these are things that are, fear, like if I say that word, it conjures something for you, but it's not like a fulsome description of what that is or what it feels like. So when Clarice is searching through language for this God, like if you can name God in the right way, then that person, that God, like you would understand that essence or that being more. And in the same way, you could discuss loneliness, or you could discuss anger or freedom or independence in a more, freedom is a word that comes up again and again and again. And yet it's something that it's very difficult to understand. And what she's doing throughout the whole entire thing is to try to use language, which is extremely limited. She's trying to use language in new ways in order to really help us understand things beyond what the word itself is saying. And very importantly, before we dive in, again, I promise we're about to dive in, but it's important to note that the limits of language and this incredible, like this urgent search that she has for words that actually mean what she wants, like words that are broad and precise and deep and wide enough, which are totally contradictory terms, but any kind of word that could truly express something, she's always searching for that. And I think it's helpful to realize that that manifests itself in a lot of ways in this book, but there are three kind of main ways where I think we see it pretty clearly. One is stream of consciousness. So what we have, stream of consciousness, is just like you're in someone's thoughts. They're often fragmented, they are chaotic, they're not logical, they're not linear. We also have, sensations of the body. We have a lot more emotions because we're working on the level of, the psyche, not on the level of the brain as much. So you have this idea of stream of consciousness, which again is trying to capture the way someone is thinking. We also have figurative language. So figurative language is any kind of language that is doing more than simply what it is denoting. So if you have, a metaphor or a simile or a personification, anytime that a word is kind of doing double duty, that is an example of trying to stretch language. It's one of these examples. Figurative language is people trying to stretch language all the time. When someone's making a comparison, I literally cannot think of one single metaphor right now. Let's just think of a very bad one, which is like her smile was like the sun. So you're comparing two different things, but you have like this idea of trying to describe someone's smile because her smile is not telling us enough. And you're describing it with another word, another object. So all of that figurative language is trying to do this thing of like trying to describe things better than a simple word can do. You also have it in this book with a lot of onomatopoeia. So that just simply means words that sound like they are. And in the beginning, she has like clack, 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 which is a very obvious thing. Like she's describing the sound of her dad using the typewriter. But you also have it throughout in all of these different ways. She'll choose words that are very onomatopoeic. I think that's how you don't say onomatopoetic. I should have looked this up before because I ran into this problem once before. But I don't know how you pronounce it. But the idea of like a word like crash or flop, those are words that sound like the thing. It's not just clack, clack, clack. You're not describing just a sound, but the actual word for something is very much like the sound. So you can understand how that word gets a little bit closer to what the thing is because it sounds like the thing. So it's really helpful to have Benjamin Moser telling us in the intro here about this mystic searching for like a word that is actually going to describe things well. And then we can think about these three ways: stream of consciousness, figurative language, and onomatopoeia, where we see her stretching language to do exactly that, to find a way to describe things that heretofore have not been described well. Okay, we're finally going to dive into the book. Of course, we're going to take a look at this epigraph, so we might be talking about the epigraph for like a half an hour. Probably not, but we could. So here we have, again, this was her fiancé at the time, suggested this as an epigraph and also as a title. So it is from James Joyce. It is from Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and even that is like a nice kind of echo here because it's describing a young man in much the way that this is describing a young woman. But what we have is this: he was alone. He was unheeded, happy, and near to the wild heart of life. So a bunch of things are happening here. One is that we're starting off with a male person. So in this book, part of the freedom that we have with our main character, with Joanna, is this idea of her not really ascribing so much to the patriarchy. Even the way that she is with her father when she's a tiny girl, he's like, go play. And she's like, I already played. This is someone who is speaking truth to power where the patriarchy is concerned. So when she has this, she's choosing James Joyce, who in 1943 is a major, major player. And then we have her saying it seems simple, but the idea of he was alone, the idea of taking a male thing, a male person, and having that epigraph be about a male person when the book is concerned with a woman, it's doing this very important thing. It's very subtle, but it's important. It's raising her. It's like when we think of this person in the epigraph, this he who is the portrait of the artist as the young man, she's kind of putting our Joanna on that same level, because you're meant to read this, of course, as an indication of what is happening also with Joanna. It's also important. He was alone. So the idea of being alone is extremely important. She is someone, Joanna, now I'm mostly talking about Joanna and not Clarice. Although, I mean, there are a lot of ways that the biographical data here is kind of inviting us to see to see Joanna and Clarice as maybe not the same person, but there is a lot of autobiographical data that might, allow us to think that at least some of her, at least her early childhood experience is informing her work. And all throughout, as she's kind of pushing back against the patriarchy, she's really fine being alone. I mean, this is a book about finding your power and having freedom. And in lots of ways, that freedom translates into being alone in a way that's really important. So I love this declarative sentence at the beginning, he was alone, that's like really doing a lot of work. Then we have, he was unheeded, happy, and near to the wild heart of life. So the idea of unheeded, people are not doing like what he wants to be doing. I think that's the connotation here. Fine. I mean, I don't think that Joanna really cares either if people are, following along with what she's saying or approving of what she is doing. And then it is very important, this happy part. So the idea of being alone and unheeded, but also happy, speaks to like an individuality. This is someone like being alone and unheeded are things that most people would not like. But in this case, this is an individual, he, who, and also Joanna, who is happy being those ways, which is really, it's important because it speaks to the individuality and also to these ideas of freedom and of not being kind of tethered. Of course, it's important to note, too, that like James Joyce as a young man had a totally different future ahead of him in terms of being tethered. I mean, any young woman had a very different life ahead of her just because there would have been expectations about serving, a husband and children. So it's much more important even that we have Clarice throughout this book speaking of Joanna as someone who in her independence and in her happiness at being alone and being singular, I mean, she's not always happy. There's actually a lot of struggle in it, but she understands that being alone, being solitary and sort of contained in herself is better than trying to have some sort of union with other people. It's also really important here that we have wild heart. So in the Portuguese version, it is perto do, I can't even say it. It's selvagem is the word. It's selvagem, selvagem. So what's important there, oh my gosh, and do not talk to me about my pronunciation. I'm sure it's terrible. But what's important there is like near to the wild heart. In Portuguese, you have more of a connotation of savage heart. And salvaje in Spanish, it means wild. Like it's not quite like savage in the way that we think about it in English, but you do have a closer idea of like a savage heart. There's a little more kind of like violence and a little more of a rupture that you have in the Portuguese version that I really like, and I think it's an important distinction because near to the wild heart is obviously it's the title of the book also, but that distinction is important with savage. And we also, when we're thinking of the savage thing and of wild, we need to think about, or we don't need to, you don't need to think about anything, but it makes me think of all of these different animals that Joanna becomes. I mean, she doesn't become animals, but there are lots of times where she is compared to animals. And again, this is that stretching of language. Her aunt calls her a viper. And then later on, she totally, not co-ops, but she uses that and talks herself about being a viper. She talks about being a wild cat. At one point, she's comparing herself to Lydia, and she says that she was a feathered creature and Lydia was a furry creature. And that is, it's such a good example of the way that she is stretching the language. It tells us so much. She is a free character, this feathered creature. She is someone who can fly. She is someone who can leave situations. She's also someone who's not like, you don't want to like cuddle up to something that's feathered. At least I don't. Whereas furry is, it sounds like someone who's going to like live in a little like underground burrow somewhere. And it's someone who's very cuddly and someone who is kind of like inconsequential, like the sound of the word furry. It just sounds kind of like juvenile and something you might be able to dismiss. Which all of this idea of the wildness is reflected in these animals. And that's why in many ways I think the title is so genius. And the last thing that I will say here, when the title of the book, it's just Near to the Wild Heart. But when we have the epigraph, it's Near to the Wild Heart of Life. And I think that's important because it's really widening the scope here. Like the magnitude of the book, this is not a book that's just about, love. Like you might think that Near to the Wild Heart just has to do with romance. But in fact, it has to do with the wild heart of life. Like this is something that's very heavyweight. It's something that's really speaking to the whole idea of life, which really raises like the magnitude of what it is that she's trying to do. Okay, so now we're going to dive into the actual text itself. So one of the things that's very important are these chapter headings. And chapter feels a little bit loose, but we do actually have a pretty good chronology here. Like the book is moving, fairly like consistently from when she is a child on until she is an adult. Not really. Like we have a lot of incursions, like a lot of excursions into the past where she's remembering things. But we do have, we start with her childhood and we end with this kind of epiphany that she has as like a 20-something. But these titles are very plain, but they're really important. So in this case, we have the father, and then we have an ellipse. So the ellipses are so important. They're throughout the whole book, and often they will be in the title. Sometimes you have one before and after the title, sometimes just after the title. So obviously an ellipse it's standing, it's like a silence. It's like a pause. You have a lacuna there, like a blank there. And if you have, often it can mean like a continuation of something. So in this case, we have the father ... meaning we have like the idea of this father kind of moving forward, but we also don't, it's like the father doesn't have anything to say. The father has a presence that will continue ... but we also, it's not clear what the presence is or what he, what it is that he has to offer. It's also important to note, of course, we have the conspicuous absence of the mother. So right at the start, we're talking about the father, but not the mother. And that is speaking to this patriarchy. So throughout the book, there's a lot of concern about the father. There's a lot of concern about the teacher. We do have some very strong women characters like the aunt, but Ottavio is someone who has a really large presence. So there are a lot of men, the man, who she ends up with later. All of these different people, a lot of them are men who end up feeling like authority figures. And if we do know about her biography that her father had a hard time having success, both like monetary, but also just like fitting in Brazil, it's all the more poignant when we're starting at the beginning here. I'm going to read pages 3 and 4 and talk to you a bit about the prose. Literally we could sit here for hours and hours, which we are not going to do. Mostly I'm going to point out some of the things in the very beginning that you should focus on if you are, or like when you're thinking about the book, you can think about these things as kind of prominent in order to understand what it is that she's emphasizing and what she's up to. One of the things I always say here at the Foxed Page is if you want to like get a more rich reading experience, you just have to pay attention. And one of the good things to do is to pay attention to the title, but then also to slow down, and also a chapter title. I'm actually famous for just like skipping right over those, famous in my own mind. But you also, if it is a challenging text in particular, if you slow down and really take a look at the opening paragraph, it will help you understand how you are supposed to focus your attention, what the literature, like what the language and the syntax and stuff is all about. If you can get a good handle on it in the beginning, it makes it much easier as you are moving through. So here's what we have. Her father's typewriter went clack, 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 clack. The clock awoke in dustless Tindlin. The silence dragged out. Zzz. What did the wardrobe say? Clothes, clothes, clothes. No, no. Amidst the clock, the typewriter, and the silence, there was an ear listening, large, pink, and dead. The three sounds were connected by the daylight and the squeaking of the trees' little leaves rubbing against one another, radiant. So you can imagine it doesn't. There is no comma in my voice at the end there when it says when I said rubbing against one another, radiant. You could imagine if there were a comma there, it would make more sense because you're describing it. But that's probably one of those times when you have this word that's kind of like thrown in there in kind of an odd syntactical way. And I imagine this has to do with the Portuguese and with the case that you might have with that word that helps us understand its position in the sentence. But I want to back up to the beginning here. So obviously the presence of the father is important. And we have her father, which is so interesting. I mean, here we are, like literally talking about the first two words as being fascinating, but they are. So her father is so important because the father, it's the name of the chapter, and this is all about the father. Like, this is, she as a young girl, of course, she's kind of central in some ways, but really she is focusing, like the presence of the father is what is important here. But in a very sneaky way, the idea of her father, we are deeply, in some ways, like put into her psychology and her perspective. It is a third person narrator. There are a couple of times when Clarice has us in the first person, but almost always we have this as a third person narrator. This is important because a lot of this is from Joanna's perspective, but we also have like what Ottavio is thinking, and we have what Lydia is thinking. It's this very important way that you have this kind of kaleidoscopic thing where you're seeing things from different people's perspectives, and not only from their perspectives, but you're like hearing what is happening for them psychologically, which is really interesting. Importantly, we don't see as much of that with the father or the aunt. We're not entering into the minds of the generation above. And again, the absence of the mother here is very conspicuous. And then as we are moving in here, of course, her father is writing. So you have this idea, he's a very learned man. She goes on to study law. So clearly this is a family where writing and the idea of producing language is important. We have the typewriter right at the start. We also have the idea of time. So we have a clock right at the beginning. Anytime in literature that you run into like a clock or time, you should think of mortality. So anytime someone's like really focusing on time and the passage of time, what's kind of at the foundation of that is really this like harsh reality of the human condition, that we are all going to die. We don't know when we are going to die. No one has any sense of like how much time they actually have. So any kind of preoccupation with time, which we have here, is also a preoccupation with mortality. I loved the fact here that we have, what did the wardrobe say? Clothes, clothes, clothes. No, no. There is so many times that the word nude and naked come up in this book, which I love. There's this idea of stripping things down to kind of the animal essence, like to getting close to the wild heart here. And I love the idea of like what nudity has to say. It's like trying to get like past all sorts of societal stuff, past taboos about the body. The treatment of sex in this book is so interesting. I don't think we're going to have time to talk about it. But it really has to do with this idea of like wanting to have union with someone. And in some ways, you can have physical union with people, but also it always falls short. There's no way that you can actually kind of unite with someone else. But I like the idea of like clothes, clothes, clothes. And she's like, no, no. So there's this idea too of like throwing off like society's expectations and being like your true self. So then we have the idea of this ear. It's large, pink, and dead. So this is when I think we were like getting into territory where this is a difficult book. These people, they're like, oh, it's not difficult to understand. I'm like, if you really dig in, it is. I think that we have some ambiguity here about whether this is the father's ear. The fact that it is large and pink, I think you could imagine that being like, I'm imagining like big kind of fleshy ears, and dead in the sense that he is not really hearing her. We can also imagine that it is her own ear. I think you can argue this either way, because it is pink, and it's pink in the sense of like being young and youthful. And if we're trying to think of it as her ear, it's large in the sense that her sense of hearing is what is most engaged. And this idea of it being dead is this sense of her as not understanding how to live. This is someone who is trying to have meaning in her day and in her life. And the way she's doing it is by trying to engage with her father. She wants to play. She writes him a poem. She wants to read the poem to him. So you have this sense of her wanting to engage with her father, and it's not working particularly well. The last thing I will say is this idea of the tree. It says right here, the squeaking of the tree's little leaves rubbing against one another radiant. So throughout this book, I mentioned figurative language. We have something that is called a motif. We actually have a bunch of different motifs. So a motif is simply when you have like a metaphor that's extended that like goes throughout the whole entire book. And one of those in this case is this idea of wood. So at one point we have the idea of a woman. At this point right now, I can't remember if it is her. I think it's not her. But we have this idea of her as feeling like a dry branch, whoever this woman is. So you have this idea of something, that is dead and something that is fragile. And when you think of branches and trees, you can think of family trees, you can think of growth, you can think of nature, you can think of roots. But so we have this idea of a dead branch. Then at other times, we have the idea of like more supple wood that is like, young and like flexible and growing. Then we have the idea of a trunk. So throughout, we have again and again, we have this idea of small branches of wood. And when we have this in the very beginning, that all of these things are like tied together because of the tree and the leaves, rubbing one against the other, you should be thinking as you're moving along, if you're running into another tree or branches or leaves, that is something that you should be paying attention to. So we're going to leave the first page and we are going to page 9. So this is the second chapter. And in many ways, this to me feels kind of like, well, this is not true. In the beginning, we are really in Joanna's, like in her subconscious, and we're hearing these different things. But really the focus there is the father. And then on page 9, we have the chapter title, which is Joanna's Day. And what happens here in some ways, I feel like this is her like actual introduction, because instead of this kind of like everything that is going on around her and like her kind of like in the first part, we're like taking things in through her perception, but there is a certain distance because we're really preoccupied with the father. Now we're really sinking into Joanna herself. So on page 9, it is Joanna's Day. There's no ellipse on either side. And then we have just like a heck of an opening here. The certainty that evil is my calling, thought Joanna. So, I mean, wow, that is a doozy. So a bunch of different things here. It's fragmented, which again speaks to this kind of stream of consciousness. And it also is signaling to us that fragments are like, that's an important piece of what's happening here, because she can't, just describe things easily in sentences, because she's not going to pretend that you can just like give a sentence and just like have someone understand it and the whole concept will be absorbed. What she's dealing with here, ideas of connection with people, of loneliness, of independence, of death, of time, all of these are things that defy any kind of easy explanation. But what's interesting too is right at the beginning here, we have this idea of evil. This is a book that is really concerned with good and evil. And we see this right from the start. In many ways, her power comes from this idea of being like not evil exactly, but really having a kind of independence that in many ways like demands that she is not accommodating to other people. And the other thing that's important here about this first sentence is we have the evil is my calling. So it feels like first person. And then we have thought Joanna. So this is very clever, because often when we have our third person narrator, you'll have like Ottavio thought or thought Joanna. So you have this ability to get into the person's first person, meaning like their own words, they're saying my, and it's really forceful. Like it's a very different thing. Like if the sentence read, the certainty that evil is her calling, is very different than the certainty that evil is my calling. So it's very clever the way that this like thought Joanna, the third person narrator, is like switching a little bit, is kind of allowing us into the third. And then we move on, that we're kind of like in her mind a little bit, and we have this. What else was that feeling of contained force, ready to burst forth in violence, that longing to apply it with her eyes closed, all of it, with the rash confidence of a wild beast? Wasn't it in evil alone that you could breathe fearlessly, accepting the air and your lungs? Not even pleasure would give me as much pleasure as evil, she thought, surprised. She felt a perfect animal inside her, full of contradictions, of selfishness and vitality. So crazy. I mean, it's just like, it's so dense. It's such an incredible like a synthesis of what we're doing here. And then it's a little surprising, because we obviously have the child, Joanna, in the first chapter. And on page 9 here, we have this. This is the next paragraph. She remembered her husband, who possibly wouldn't recognize her in this idea. She tried to remember what Ottavio looked like. The minute she sensed he had left the house, however, she transformed, concentrated on herself, and as if she had merely been interrupted by him, continued slowly living the thread of her childhood, forgetting him and moving from room to room profoundly alone. From the quiet neighborhood, from the distant houses, no sounds reached her, and, free. Not even she knew what she was thinking. This is so crucial. It is so incredibly rewarding to go back and look at the beginning of something once you are finished. So what we have here is Clarice is establishing a present moment. So we are beginning this book with this idea of this moment of crisis when Joanna is married to Ottavio, but is clearly looking like she's not happily in relationship with him, because she really wants free. That she has this wild animal inside her that really speaks to freedom. She wants that freedom. And it's so cool because we have now this sense that she was thinking about her childhood, the father, in that first chunk. And then on page 9, we are entering into like this present moment. And the reason why that's important is because that will allow her to go back in time and to talk about being with her aunt when she was little. I mean, her father's going to die soon. The mother is already dead. She has to go live with the aunt. She has to go to boarding school. She has to do all of these different things. But this present moment when she's married and we have the name Ottavio, we have these kind of anchors. And then the structure is such that it allows us to go and dip into these, moments with the teacher who is disgusting, and like all of these different important like events that are occurring for her in the past. So I want to read like a tiny bit at length here. This is a passage, it's only like a page, where she is, she's with Ottavio and she's speaking again to this idea of physical union with him. But what's important here, and what I would like you to focus on, is this idea of writing as coming from the body, as language and sensation and words, as the body, as kind of the locus for language, that language is really embedded in the body, and that Clarice is someone who really writes from the body. So they're in bed here. And then there's an ellipse, ... There are lots of silences in this book. She began in a low voice, but everything she could say wasn't enough. She was living. She watched him, how he slept, how he existed. She had never felt him so much, which tells you a lot. When she had joined him in marriage in the early days, her enchantment had come to her from her own discovered body. And again, it's about herself. It's a freedom. It's contained inside her, not with him. The renewal had been hers. She hadn't overflowed to the man and had remained isolated. Now she suddenly understood that love could make you desire the next moment in an impulse that was life. She felt the world palpitate softly in her chest. Her body hurt as if she bore the femininity of all women in it. And then across the page, she is again speaking to him while he's sleeping. I ... She began again to Ottavio. So first she's saying my, then she's saying I, but nothing follows. You have silence. It was darker. All she could see of him was a shadow. He was fading more and more, slipping through her hands, dead at the bottom of sleep. And she, as solitary as the ticking of a clock in an empty house. Alone in the world, crushed by the excess of life, feeling the music vibrate too high for a body. But liberation came, and Joanna shook with its impulse. ... Because, as mild and sweet as daybreak in a wood, inspiration was born. Then she made up what she should say. Eyes closed, surrendered, she softly spoke words born in that instant, never before heard by anyone, still tender from their creation. Fragile, new shoots. They were less than words, just loose, meaningless, warm syllables that flowed and merged, were fertilized and reborn in a single being, only to break apart immediately afterwards, breathing. So you have this idea of the language here as really being very much in the body. Her eyes grew moist with soft happiness and gratitude. She had spoken, the words coming from her before language, from the source itself. She moved closer to him, giving him her soul, and nevertheless feeling complete, as if she had drunk down a world. She was like a woman. The dark trees in the garden were secretly watching the silence. She just knew. She fell asleep. Incredible. So what we really just have this incredible meditation here about language and about silence and about body and about the impossibility of capturing a lot of this language, about like the idea of words before language. It's like the idea that you want to express, that you have this idea of needing to define something, to make it real, and you have that beforehand, and as soon as you use language, you're essentially limiting yourself. Okay, now we're not going to do that party trick where I'm just going to like zip through the book here and just open it at any page, and we're going to read the first full sentence and see what we get. I'm dying because probably nothing. It'll probably be like the one sentence in the book that's just like very straightforward. Okay, I just stopped on page 61. So we have this. One day, after speaking at last, will I still have something to live on? Or will everything I say fall short of or beyond life? I try to push away everything that is life form. So I just looked, this is in a chapter called The Bath. And I mean, it's here. We have this very significant thing just on this one random page. So it's interesting here that we have the first person, and we do that. Occasionally she just like Clarice allows us to be in the first person. And it's very interesting to feel the distance that you have with the third person versus the immediacy with the first person when she's saying I, which really speaks to the way that language, in many ways it's doing a good job. It's allowing us to feel these different distances from another being, but it also is falling short in obviously so many ways. So this is at a point in her marriage when she's really trying to figure out what her role will be, like what her essence will be. So one day after speaking at last, will I still have nothing to live on? So this idea of like independence and freedom, usually they're not quite that concrete. They're kind of more like these abstract ideas. But here it's like this very concrete idea, like what does actual marriage look like? And then the next sentence is, or will everything I say fall short of or beyond life? I mean, that's like the central question of the whole entire book. This is maybe where I get a little bit of that repetition. I mean, the central question of life is like, is the thing that I'm going to articulate, is it going to be too much or too little? It's this incredible preoccupation with language that she's actually stating in this very clear form. And then we have a dash, an M dash, my favorite punctuation mark, and it says this. I try to push away everything that is a life form. I try to isolate myself in order to find life in itself. I mean, this is like a psychological, philosophical, metafictional, metaphysical kind of exploration here. Like she's really, these are very, very large questions that she's asking in under the auspices of marriage. And I actually have a part marked down a little bit lower that I want to read. But even so, in the white, unlimited solitude where I fall, I am still stuck between closed mountains. Stuck. So here we have the idea of a metaphor, the mountains, and then the stuck. That's that kind of like stream of consciousness. And then we have this. Where is the imagination? I walk on invisible tracks. Captivity, freedom. These are the words that occur to me. However, they are not the true, only irreplaceable ones I feel. Freedom isn't enough. What I desire doesn't have a name yet. I am thus a toy that is wound up and which, when done, will not find its own deeper life. Oh my gosh, incredible. Here we have a bunch of figurative language. We have this idea, like she's literally saying the thing I desire doesn't have a name yet. It's this unceasing, unrelenting search for both something kind of mystic, like some sort of union with the divine, but also just sort of like a sense of life as being fully lived. So that is insane. Like this is, I randomly opened to page 61, and here we have like this, like in, the framework of this marriage, this idea like of language and of freedom and of captivity. It's astonishing, like what she's packing into every single page. And what we're going to do at the end here is I'm just going to read the last, like essentially the last page and a bit at the end of the book. If you're someone who doesn't want to hear the end of the book, then right now I can say thank you for tuning in. Happy reading, as I always say at the end. But truly, thank you for listening. But for anyone who wants to hear the end, it's very satisfying in some ways, and also really, as you might imagine, it is not kind of like, well, it's nothing close to like your typical ending of a novel. So on page 193, we have this. What was rising in her was not courage. She was substance alone, less than human. How could she be a hero and want to defeat things? She wasn't a woman. She existed, and what she had inside her were movements lifting her always in transition. Maybe at some point she had modified with her wild force the air around her, and no one would ever notice. Maybe she had invented with her breathing new matter, and didn't know it. merely feeling that her tiny woman's mind could never comprehend. Throngs of warm thoughts sprouted and spread through her frightened body, and what mattered about them was that they concealed a vital impulse. What mattered about them was that at the very instant of their birth, there was the blind, true substance creating itself, rising up, straining at the water's surface like an air bubble, almost breaking it. She noticed that she still hadn't fallen asleep, thought she would still surely crackle on an open fire, that the long gestation of her childhood would end, and from her painful immaturity, her own being would burst forth, free at last, at last. No, I want no God. I want to be alone. And one day it will come. Yes, one day the capacity, as red and affirmative as it is clear and soft, will come in me. One day, whatever I do will be blindly, surely, unconsciously, standing in myself, in my truth, so entirely cast in what I do that I will be incapable of speaking. Above all, a day will come on which all my movement will be creation. Birth. I will break all of the no's that exist in me. I will prove to myself that there is nothing to fear, that everything I am will always be where there is a woman with my beginning. I will build inside me what I am one day. With one gesture of mine, my waves will rise up powerful, pure water drowning doubt, awareness. I will be strong like the soul of an animal, and when I speak, my words will be unthought and slow, not lightly felt, not full of yearning for humanity, not the past corrupting the future. What I say will resound fatal and whole. There will be no space in me for me to know that time, man, dimensions exist. There will be no space in me to even realize that I will be creating instant by instant, not instant by instant, always welded, because then I will live. Only then will I live bigger than in my childhood. I will be as brutal and misshapen as a rock. I will be as light and vague as something felt and not understood. I will surpass myself in waves, ah, Lord, and may everything come and fall upon me, even the incomprehension of myself at certain white moments, because all I have to do is comply with myself, and then nothing will block my path until death, without fear, from any struggle or rest, I will rise up as strong and beautiful as a young horse. It's so beautiful. I have to say, for some reason, the horse at the end always surprises me. I love the idea of it being an animal, but for some reason, the horse always feels a little random. I really just brought us down here at the end with the mention of the horse, but it always does surprise me. It's such a crescendo and such an incredibly beautiful and abstract and thoughtful and fragmented and broken and strange kind of passage that something like that at the end always feels a little definitive. I'm just going to stop there. I mean, this is just, you can tell what an absolute virtuoso she is. You can also tell that we really need to read her carefully, and we could spend, literally we could go forever talking about her. But I hope that today gave you a sense of what it is she is trying to do and all of the different ways that this is unique and truly innovative and groundbreaking work. I really do like the idea of reading The Hour of the Star, so hopefully we'll get to that at some point. It just seems so nice to look at the first one and to look at the last one and just to revel in the breadth of what it is that she is doing. So I hope today deepened your appreciation of just this absolute genius. Thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.